The room was smaller than I expected. 11 meters by 8 white walls with no visible seams, a single inset panel in the ceiling throwing flat even light that had no warmth to it and no angle you could track. The floor was some kind of polished composite, not stone, not resin, something in between that your shoes didn't quite stick to and didn't quite slide on either. There was a table. There was a chair. On the table sat the assessment tablet, a flat slab roughly the size of a chopping board, matte gray, about 3 centimeters thick at its thickest point, with a display surface that had already lit up and was waiting. The Vala then billed their institutional spaces with a consistency that I had noticed in the first hour I spent at the Institute and had been noting since. The walls were always the same white, not quite the white of paper, not quite the white of clean metal, something with a slightly blue undertone that I had asked about on the first day and been told was a deliberate choice. That Valadin cognitive research had shown the specific wavelength combination to produce the lowest possible ambient influence on decision-making behavior in a broad range of tested species. The light was always flat, and even because angle and lighting produced shadow, and shadow produced spatial orientation cues, and spatial orientation cues were another variable the Institute preferred not to introduce into their controlled environments. The floors were the particular composite because it had negligible sound absorption, which meant invigilators on the other side of the observation glass could hear the respondents' footsteps and movement patterns, which were data. Everything in the room was data. That was the point of the room. I set my bag down next to the chair, pulled the chair out, sat in it. The door behind me sealed with a sound like a slow exhale. The display on the tablet showed a single line of text in compact standard, centered, unhurried. 100-fold assessment, cognitive selection protocol 7, respondent, Dr. Sira VANN, duration, open. Below that a second line, please await full option set deployment. I waited. The tablet's display rippled once, and then the options came up. They came up all at once. Not sequentially, not in columns, not numbered in any order I could parse at a glance. 100 small holographic tiles, each about the size of a thumbnail, arranged in a grid that hovered 3 centimeters above the table surface. Each tile showed a symbol. The symbols were not random. I recognized the typological family. They were drawn from the Keth Valadin abstract choice set, the same 40-base morpheme library the Institute had used in their published decision latency studies. The tiles were labeled in compact standard beneath each symbol with a short descriptor. I leaned forward and read the first 6: continuance, cessation, transition, inversion, amplification, reduction. I leaned back. I didn't need to read the rest to understand the architecture. The assessment was, as the Institute's literature described it, a maximally equivalent option set. 100 choices, all of them valid, all of them legitimate responses to a generalized cognitive prompt. The prompt was not on the tablet, there was no prompt, or rather the 100 options were the prompt. The point of the assessment was not to answer a question. The point was to watch a mind select. This was what the Valadin Institute did. Dr. Aseth Venn, my host researcher, a Keth cognitive behaviorist of some considerable reputation, had explained it to me over the first 3 days of my fellowship. The 100-fold assessment was the Institute's signature instrument. It had been administered to approximately 4,000 cognizant species representatives over the past 60 years. The resulting latency curves, how long it took a given mind to select, and which categories of option it weighted toward, were the basis of about a third of the Institute's published work on interspecies cognitive architecture. The assessment was not a test with a correct answer. It was a measurement. You selected, and the system recorded the latency between display and selection, the micro-hesitations, the eye-tracking patterns. There were sensors embedded in the table surface that I couldn't see, the sequence of false starts, the final choice. All of it fed into a profile. The profile went into the database. Your selection told them something about how your mind prioritized under maximum optionality. I had read everything the Institute had published about the hundredfold. I had read the supplementary methodology documents Aseth had sent me when I arrived. I had read the 17-page informed consent form, which included a thorough description of what the assessment measured and how. I had signed it. I understood the instrument. I was also, by training and by 15 years of practice, a cognitive behavioral researcher who specialized in decision architecture. I had spent the better part of my career studying how minds organized choices, how they weighted options, how the act of selection itself shaped subsequent behavior. I had designed assessments. I had critiqued assessment designs. I had written a monograph on the statistical artifacts that emerged when you gave a maximally equivalent option set to a mammalian mind, and assumed the resulting latency curve was meaningfully distinct from motor noise. So I looked at the 100 tiles floating above the Valathan Institute's signature assessment instrument, and I had a thought that I kept quiet. The thought was, this measures the wrong thing. Not wrong in the sense of being bad science. The science was careful and the data was real. But the instrument was built on a premise that I recognized because I had argued against a version of it in print, twice, in peer-reviewed journals, and once at a conference in front of 200 people who disagreed with me. The premise was that selection was the response. That when you put a mind in front of equivalent options, the meaningful output was the selection itself, which option, how fast, in what sequence of consideration. The premise held for most of the cognizant species in the Institute's database, because for most cognizant species, selection was in fact the response. You saw options. You weighed them. You chose. That was the cognitive act. For humans, it was a little more complicated. I did not select immediately. The assessment protocol had no time limit duration. Open, the tablet had said. I looked at the 100 tiles for approximately 4 minutes, which I was certain the eye-tracking sensors were recording as a high-ambivalence scanning pattern. Then I picked up the tablet. The tablet was solid. Heavier than it looked, dense composite housing, probably engineered for durability in a testing environment where respondents occasionally expressed frustration physically. There was a slight texture difference along the lower edge where the housing met the display surface. I ran my thumb along it. The fit was not perfect. There was a seam there, maybe half a millimeter, where two housing panels joined. I pressed on it. Nothing moved. I set the tablet back on the table and looked at my bag. I carry 2 things in my bag that are not strictly necessary for academic fieldwork. One is a folding multi-tool, titanium-handled, with 7 functions including a blade, a flat screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver, a file, and all, a wire stripper, and a bottle opener. The other is a small notebook, paper, not digital, that I use for the kind of thinking I don't want going into any networked system. I have carried both for 15 years, in the field and out of it, because fieldwork has a way of producing situations that do not appear in the equipment manifest. I took out the multi-tool and opened the blade. The display was still running. The 100 tiles still hovered. The eye-tracking sensors were, presumably, still recording. I am not impulsive. I want to be clear about that. What I did next was not impulsive, was not frustration, was not a statement. It was a research decision. I had looked at the instrument, identified the premise, identified the flaw in the premise as applied to human cognition, and decided that the most accurate response to the assessment was not a selection from among the 100 options. The most accurate response was a demonstration. The tablet housing was, as I said, dense composite. The seam along the lower edge gave me a starting point. I worked the blade tip into it, not to damage the electronics, which I was careful to avoid. I am a researcher and I have some professional ethics, but to separate the lower housing panel from the upper. It took about 12 minutes. The panel came away cleanly, revealing approximately 20 centimeters of the housing's structural material. A layered composite with a fibrous core and a rigid outer shell, not unlike certain reinforced polymers I had worked with in lab settings. The inner surface of the panel was smooth on one face and had a slight ridge structure on the other where it keyed into the tablet body. I set the panel on the table next to the now exposed tablet. Then I started working. The multi-tools blade was not ideal for this. I would have preferred a heavier blade and a flat work surface I could brace against, and the chair was not quite the right height for sustained work. I adjusted. I turned the housing panel over and examined the ridge structure on the inner face, identified the long axis, and began shaping the material along it. The composite was hard but not brittle. It had some give, which meant it could be worked without splitting if you were patient and kept your edge angle consistent. I was patient. I had been patient for 15 years of field work in disciplines where patience was not a virtue but a methodology. I kept my edge angle consistent. The 100 tiles continued to hover above the table. Somewhere on the other side of the observation glass, I knew it was there. It was standard assessment chamber architecture, and the Institute's floor plan was in the materials Aseth had sent me. The invigilators were watching. I did not look toward the glass. I focused on the work. The composite was interesting material. I had worked with harder things and with softer things, and with things that were more uniformly cooperative. This had a layered quality. 3 visible laminations when I looked at the cross-section the separated seam had exposed, each layer slightly different in density, and in the way it caught the flat overhead light. The outermost layer was the rigid shell, which had good surface hardness but would have been prone to delamination under lateral stress if I had been trying to make something that needed to flex. I wasn't. A blade doesn't flex. The middle layer was the one I was most interested in, a denser matrix with the fibrous structure I had noticed, running consistently along the long axis of the panel, which told me it had been formed in a constrained press rather than cast in place. That consistent fiber orientation was the thing that made the material workable in this context. If it had been random, I would have been fighting the material every centimeter. Following the grain, I was not fighting anything. The innermost layer was a conductive mesh, which I was careful not to cut into because I didn't know what it was connected to, and shorting an active circuit in the middle of a sealed assessment chamber would have been embarrassing professionally and potentially unpleasant physically. I kept my working line well clear of the mesh layer and let it sit at the base of the panel as a kind of natural stopping point for depth. I thought while I worked about the first time I had done anything like this. I was 11 years old, not quite 11, 10 3/4, which at that age is a meaningful distinction. My family had a small boat, a wooden-hulled thing my father had built over several years in the garage, using a set of plans he had found in a second-hand book and modified substantially, because he didn't quite agree with the original designer's decisions about the keel. The boat floated and sailed, and leaked slightly in 2 places that my father maintained were within acceptable parameters. One summer we had gone out on a lake for a weekend, 3 days, camping on shore at night, fishing during the day, and on the second day I had dropped my pocket knife over the side while trying to clean a fish. Watched it go down. The water was clear enough to see it for about 2 meters and then it was gone. I had at 10 3/4 several hours of daylight remaining, a fish to clean, and no knife. My father's knife was with my father, who was on the other side of the lake in the small dinghy they used for trolling. My mother had a folding knife somewhere in the camping kit, but the camping kit was on shore and we were not on shore. I had been looking at the situation for about 4 minutes when I picked up one of the flat, rounded stones we used to weigh down the fishing lines in current. The stone was a particular kind of river-worn quartz composite that I didn't know the name of at the time and only later looked up. Fine-grained, dense, prone to conchoidal fracture. I knew it would fracture in a useful way because I had already broken one accidentally the week before while using it as a hammer for a tent stake, and the fracture face had been clean and sharp enough to cut my thumb through a reflex contact. I struck the stone against the metal trim of the boat's gunwale at an angle I had worked out by instinct and observation. It took 4 strikes to get a flake with a useful edge. The flake was maybe 8 centimeters long and 4 wide, not a pretty object, but it cleaned the fish adequately. When my father came back across the lake, he found me with the fish cleaned and laid out and me sitting with the stone flake in my hand, examining the fracture angle. He had looked at it for a moment and said, "Where did you get that?" I told him. He looked at it again and at the broken stone and at the fish. Then he said, "That's the kind of thinking that gets things done." I had thought about that sentence a number of times since then, across 15 years of academic research and fieldwork and 2 monographs, and a position at an institution that was generally considered rigorous. The sentence was not an articulation of a philosophy. It was an observation about method. When you are out of options, you look at what you have, and you make something from it that serves the immediate purpose. This is not creativity in any elevated sense. It is not ingenuity or inspiration. It is a very old and very specific kind of problem solving that does not require the problem to be solved to have a solution already in the option field. The 100 options on the Valentine Institute's assessment tablet were all real options. None of them was wrong. If I selected any one of them, I would be providing data, and the data would be accurately recorded, and the Institute's database would have a slightly more complete human entry, and the world would be fractionally more documented. But the selection would not be honest, because the honest response to this room and this instrument and this option field was not a selection. The honest response was what I was doing. I was 4 centimeters into the shaping when the intercom clicked on. "Dr. Van." The voice was Keth-inflected compact standard, careful and neutral, one of the invigilators. "Is there a difficulty with the assessment interface?" "No," I said, without stopping what I was doing. A pause. "The assessment has not received a selection input." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. "Is there a problem with the option display?" "The display is fine." The intercom went quiet. I continued working. The Keth invigilator's phrasing had been careful, and I appreciated that. They had not said you are failing the assessment. They had not said you are required to select. They had said there had been no input, asked if there was a problem. Neutral, methodologically appropriate. The assessment protocol was, after all, open-ended in duration, and the Institute had presumably encountered a range of response behaviors across 4,000 species representatives. Pausing was probably not anomalous by their data standards. What I was doing was probably anomalous. I finished the first shaping pass and switched to the file function on the multi-tool to smooth the edge. The material took the file well. The fibrous core gave it a grain, and if you followed the grain instead of fighting it, the edge came out even without much pressure. The form I was working toward was simple. A blade approximately 14 centimeters long, 4 centimeters at its widest, tapering to a point, with a handle section that widened at the end for grip. Not elegant, I am a researcher, not a craftsperson, and a 20-centimeter housing panel is not ideal stock, but functional, recognizable. The thing I was making was recognizable. I had been working for approximately 90 minutes when the intercom clicked on again. Different voice this time, higher register, the characteristic doubled consonants of the Valentine species proper, not Keth. "Dr. Van, this is Invigilator Sarath Vale. I want to make sure you understand the parameters of the assessment." "I do," I said. "The assessment provides 100 options. You are asked to select one." "I understand that." A longer pause than the previous pauses. "You have not selected one." "Not yet." "You are currently working with a component of the assessment tablet." "Yes." The pause this time was long enough that I looked up from what I was doing. Not toward the glass. I still didn't know exactly where the observation glass was on this chamber's design, and it would have felt performative to look for it, but just up, letting my eyes rest a moment before going back to the work. "Is there something you need?" Invigilator Vale said finally. "A submission tray," I said. "For the physical component, I'll need to know where to submit it when I'm done." The intercom went quiet. I went back to work. The thing about the 100-fold assessment, which I had not put in any of my pre-fellowship documentation, because it was not relevant to the stated purpose of my fellowship, and because stating it in advance would have been, in some sense, contaminating, was that it embodied a particular view of cognition that I had spent a significant part of my career arguing was species parochial. Not wrong, parochial. It described something real about how a broad range of cognizant species processed choice under maximal optionality. It just didn't describe humans. The human response to a maximally equivalent option set. This was the thing I had published about twice and argued about at conferences, and had a polite and so far unresolved disagreement with 3 colleagues about, was not, in aggregate, to select. The human response was to make. Not always, not universally. There was variance. But in controlled experimental conditions, when you gave a human mind a situation with no distinguishable correct answer and a wide field of equivalent options, a statistically significant proportion of humans did not wait toward selection. They waited toward transformation. They looked at the option field, and they did something the option field did not anticipate. They changed the terms. Tool use, structure building, novel constraint introduction. The creation of a criterion that did not previously exist in the option field, which then permitted selection on a basis that was not present in the original option set. The 100-fold assessment had been administered to approximately 4,000 species representatives and had presumably produced 4,000 selection profiles. I was not going to be the 4,001st selection profile. I was going to be something their database did not have a column for. The invigilators did not speak to me again for 2 hours. In that 2 hours I finished the primary shaping, filed the edge to what was, under the circumstances, a reasonable working edge, shaped the handle section, and used the awl on the multi-tool to score 2 shallow grooves around the handle for grip purchase. The handle was slightly too thick for a comfortable single-hand grip, but it was solid and didn't torque when I applied lateral pressure along the blade axis. I tested the edge on a corner of the paper notebook I had in my bag, not because I needed to cut anything, but because it was the most consistent material I had available for a quick edge test. The paper parted cleanly. Not a fine blade. It would not have satisfied anyone with actual standards. But it was a blade, recognizable and functional, made from the housing of an alien cognitive assessment instrument in a sealed room where I had been offered 100 other choices. I set it on the table next to the intact tablet, which was still displaying its 100 hovering tiles, patient and exact. Then I sat back in the chair and thought about whether I wanted to write anything down. I carry the paper notebook for the kind of thinking I don't want going into networked systems, as I said. But the observation sensors were almost certainly recording the room's visual field in full, and writing in the notebook would be recorded just as anything else was. I decided the notebook was unnecessary. Whatever I wanted to say, I could say out loud. "Invigilator Vale," I said. A brief pause, then, "Yes, Dr. Van." "I've finished." A longer pause. "You have made a selection from the option set." "No," I said. "I've completed the work. I need to know where to submit the physical component." The silence on the other end of the intercom had a different quality than the previous silences. The previous silences had been the quality of mild procedural uncertainty. This one had the quality of something being discussed. I waited. I was good at waiting. After approximately 3 minutes, I was watching the clock on my secondary wrist unit, the one I keep on compact standard time. The door at the far end of the room, opposite from where I had entered, opened. Not the door I had come through. A different door, which meant this chamber had at least 2 access points, which was not in the floor plan I had been sent. Invigilators sometimes used secondary access points. It was a normal design feature. I noted it without particular interest. Invigilator Vale came through the door. She was Valathan. I had met her briefly at the intake session before the assessment. A tall figure with the characteristic Valathan bilateral cranial ridge, and a skin tone that shifted in the spectrum just below visible for humans, but registered as a faint shimmer at the edges of my field of vision. She was accompanied by two Keth colleagues in assessment invigilator markings, and by Dr. Aseth Venn, my host, who had the expression that I had come to recognize in the past week as Aseth's version of intense professional concentration. They stood inside the door. They looked at the table. The table had the assessment tablet display still running, 100 tiles still hovering, no selection recorded. Next to the tablet, the lower housing panel separated from the tablet body. Next to the housing panel, the carved piece, the knife, though I had not called it that to Invigilator Vale because I had been waiting to see what they called it. Invigilator Vale said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You removed a component of the assessment equipment." "Yes," I said. "And then you modified it." "Yes." She paused. The two Keth invigilators were looking at each other with a micro-expression exchange I didn't have enough Keth behavioral data to read accurately. Aseth was looking at the table with an expression I couldn't read at all, which was unusual because Aseth was generally quite readable. "Into a cutting instrument," Vale finished. "A blade," I said, "roughly speaking. It would hold a better edge if the stock were more suited to it, but the composite worked adequately." Vale looked at me. "This is not a selection from the option set." "No," I said, "it isn't. The assessment protocol requires a selection from the option set." "I know what the assessment protocol requires," I said. "I read the informed consent documentation. I understand the instrument. What I'm submitting is not a selection from the option set because I don't think a selection from the option set accurately represents how my cognition processed the situation the option set presented." Vale's cranial ridge shifted slightly, the Valathan analog to a raised eyebrow, as I understood it. "You are declining to complete the assessment." "I'm submitting an alternate response format," I said. "Whether the assessment framework can accommodate it is your question, not mine. My response is the object on the table." One of the Keth invigilators said something in Keth primary that was too fast for my working vocabulary. The other replied. Aseth turned toward them and said something in Keth primary that stopped the exchange flat. Then Aseth looked at me. Aseth Venn had been at the Valathan Institute for 31 years. She had administered or overseen the administration of more than 1,000 hundredfold assessments. She had co-authored the foundational methodology paper. She had, in 3 conversations with me over the past week, been politely and consistently skeptical of my published work on human decision architecture. Not dismissively skeptical, but the productive kind of skeptical that meant she had read it carefully and had specific objections. She was, in my assessment, one of the 2 or 3 most rigorous cognitive researchers I had encountered in 15 years in the field. She looked at me, and then she looked at the blade on the table, and then she looked back at me. "Selection under maximal optionality," she said slowly, in compact standard, "produces a profile. The profile indicates cognitive weighting. Cognitive weighting tells us how a mind prioritizes." "Yes," I said. "You are telling me that your cognition does not prioritize selection in this context." "I'm telling you that my cognition in this context did not experience the 100 options as a field requiring selection. It experienced them as a constraint on the action space. The action that was not in the option set was the action my cognition weighted toward." "Making a tool," Aseth said. "Making a tool," I agreed. A silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable or not uncomfortable for me. I couldn't speak to the invigilators. Vale was standing very still, which in Valathan behavioral vocabulary I understood to indicate processing rather than distress. The two Keth invigilators had stopped their conversation. Oseth was looking at the blade. "This is not," Oseth said eventually, "something the assessment instrument has encountered before." "I know. 4,012 species representative assessments," she said. "Over 62 years of data collection." "I read the methodology papers," I said. "None of them produced a physical object." "I imagine not." Oseth picked up the blade. She turned it over in her hands, the Valathan equivalent of hands, paired manipulators with 6 fine digits on each, examining the edge, the handle, the score marks I had made for grip. She pressed her digit tip against the edge without applying pressure to test it. "The edge is adequate," she said. "The stock isn't ideal," I said. "If you had access to the right composite feed, it would be considerably better. But the housing material has the right fibrous structure if you follow the grain." Oseth set the blade down. She looked at the tablet. The 100 tiles were still hovering, patient and indifferent, waiting for a selection that was not going to come. "The assessment protocol," she said, "does not have a submission category for physical objects." "I know. We would need to create one." "That seems right." She looked at me again with that expression I couldn't read. One of the Keth invigilators had taken out a recording device of some kind, handheld, small, not a type I recognized, and was making notes. The other was taking photographs of the table with what looked like a standard institute documentation unit. "Dr. Van," Oseth said, "I want to understand your reasoning." "My reasoning is in the paper I published in the Journal of Cognitive Behavioral Systems, Volume 43, Issue 2, I said. "The one you told me on Tuesday you had objections to." "I have objections to your statistical interpretation of the optionality suppression data," she said. "I do not have objections to the underlying behavioral observation." I said that. "You did," I agreed. "You are now providing me a field instance of the behavioral observation." "Under controlled conditions," I said. "Invigilated, sensor-recorded, fully documented. Yes." Oseth was quiet for a moment. The Keth invigilator with the recorder had paused and was looking between us. Vale had moved slightly, angling herself to see the table more clearly. "The assessment protocol," Oseth said, "was designed to measure cognitive response to maximal optionality. The assumption underlying the design is that selection is the cognitive response." "Yes," I said. "Your position is that, for human cognition, transformation is the cognitive response. For a statistically significant subset of human cognition, in a statistically significant subset of maximal optionality conditions," I said. "I don't want to overstate the universality. There's variance. But yes. The instrument is measuring the right thing, just not from the right baseline assumption about what the relevant cognitive act is." "And you," Oseth said, "did not think it would be useful to tell me this before you sat down for the assessment." "I thought it would be more useful to demonstrate it," I said. "Published data is one kind of evidence. You had objections to my statistical interpretation. An invigilated, sensor-recorded field instance in your own assessment environment is a different kind of evidence. I thought you might find it more compelling." The room was quiet again. Then Oseth made a sound that I had not heard a Valathan make before, a low, resonant, two-toned vocalization that my translation implant rendered as untranslatable, paralinguistic, and that I provisionally interpreted as something in the register of reluctant satisfaction. "You came to my institute," she said, "on a cognitive behavioral research fellowship." "Yes." "And you used my assessment instrument as a research instrument." "A demonstration instrument," I said, "under your institute's own observational conditions. I'll write it up, obviously. And I'll share the full data with you, the eye tracking, the selection latency, whatever your sensors recorded, because it's your equipment and your facility and you have full rights to the data. That is, Vale said from behind Aseth very carefully, an unusual position. I'm a researcher, I said. The data is the data. I want you to have it. I want you to do whatever the right analysis of it is. If my interpretation is wrong, I want to know. Another silence. The Keth invigilator with the recorder had resumed noting. The other was still documenting the table. Aseth set the blade back on the table. She looked at it for a moment, then at the 100 hovering tiles, then at me. I will need to consult with the Assessment Review Committee, she said, regarding how to categorize this assessment session in the database. Of course, the physical object will need to be entered into the Institute's materials log. That seems right. And I will want, she said, a copy of your data-sharing proposal in writing before the end of the fellowship week. I'll have it to you by morning, I said. Aseth looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I was not uncomfortable and I did not think she was either. Discomforted, possibly. Uncertain of the procedural pathway, certainly, but not uncomfortable. Your fellowship review, she said, was due at the end of the month. Yes. I think, she said slowly, I will need to extend it. I had not expected that. I kept the surprise off my face because keeping things off my face is a professional skill I have spent 15 years developing. How long? I said. I don't know yet, she said. We have 4,012 data points in the selection database. We now have one data point in a category that does not yet have a name. I will need time to determine what that means for the instrument. She said this in the tone of someone who found this genuinely unsettling and was choosing to engage with it rather than not. I respected that. I'm available, I said. Yes, she said, you are. She picked up the blade one more time, turned it over, set it down, and then she and the invigilators left through the secondary door. Aseth paused at the door. Dr. Van, she said. Yes. The instrument you have built, from the housing material. Roughly speaking, I said. It is functional. Adequately, I said. She looked at it on the table, a tool for cutting. Among other things, I said, depending on what needs to be done. Aseth made the two-tone sound again, then she left. The door sealed. The room was quiet. The 100 tiles continued to hover above the table, patient and exact, waiting for a selection that no one was coming back to make. I sat in the chair and looked at the table, the intact tablet with its floating tiles, the separated housing panel. The blade I had made from it, clean-edged and functional, sitting on the composite floor of a sealed assessment chamber in an alien institute that had been running the same instrument for 62 years, and had never produced a physical object before. I took out the paper notebook and wrote 3 things down, not for any networked system but for myself, because some thinking needs to be in a form you can hold. The first thing I wrote was, the instrument measures what it measures, the data is real. The second thing I wrote was, the instrument was not designed for this population. Design decisions have assumptions. Assumptions are not universal. The third was not really a note. It was a calculation. Aseth had said 4,012 assessments over 62 years. One data point in an unnamed category. If you wanted to build a proper sampling framework for what I now represented in her database, you would need, I did the rough arithmetic, at minimum 30 additional human respondents, ideally from a range of professional and cognitive backgrounds, and probably another 15 from non-standard human populations, and a revised protocol that didn't require damaging the assessment equipment. The fourth thing I wrote, I had said 3, but there were 4, was a note to myself about the population question, which was the part of my published argument that Aseth had said she found most interesting and most problematic. Her objection was statistical. I had used a sample of 48 human respondents in the optionality suppression study, which was small for a cross-species comparison, and my error bars on the transformation response frequency were correspondingly wide. She was right. 48 was small. I had gotten 48 because recruiting human respondents for a study on decision behavior under maximal optionality was harder than it sounded. The assessment conditions required a sealed room, a controlled option field, and an invigilated observation session, and most humans I had asked to participate had looked at those conditions and declined on the grounds that it sounded either boring or unpleasant or both. What it had been, in my experience, was neither. It had been interesting. The 48 respondents had produced exactly the variance I had expected and documented, a plurality that behaved as the standard optionality models predicted, selecting from the option field with latency patterns consistent with the published mammalian cognition literature. A significant minority, roughly 30%, who showed extended non-selection behavior and ultimately produced some form of environment modification or tool creation before arriving at a selection, or in lieu of one. And a small but replicable subset, 7 out of 48, which was too small to be confident about but too consistent to ignore, who did not select at all and submitted a physical modification to the test environment as their only response. I had been in that study, running the assessments from behind the observation glass. I had administered the instrument, not taken it. What I had just done was technically a case study of n=1, which was not publishable on its own, but was publishable as a demonstration instance accompanying the revised methodology proposal if the Institute agreed to co-document it. The fact that it had occurred under the Institute's own sensor infrastructure, with their invigilators present and their documentation teams recording, was the thing that made it more than anecdote. I added a note to the calculation: request full sensor data from session, including eye tracking, prior to any analysis. Confirm Institute's data retention policy for invigilated sessions. Establish whether session data is Institute property, respondent property, or joint. Flag for data sharing agreement. I would need to discuss the last point with Aseth. The tablet housing was engineered for durability, but it was still Institute property, and I had modified it without prior permission, which was technically a violation of the informed consent terms and would need to be addressed in the data sharing proposal. I added a note to the calculation: flag equipment modification, offer replacement cost or fabrication cost, whichever the Institute preferred. Then I closed the notebook, put it back in the bag, put the multi-tool back in the bag, and picked up the blade. I held it for a moment, testing the balance, which was not good. The handle was too heavy for the blade length, a consequence of the stock limitations, and then set it down. It belonged to the materials log now, not mine to take. I stood up, collected my bag, and went to the first door, the one I had come in through, and knocked twice on the interior surface, which was the standard request to open signal in Valethan facility protocol. The door opened after a short wait. The corridor outside was empty. At the far end, one of the Keth invigilators was waiting, presumably to walk me back to the fellow researcher wing. I went to meet him. It had been a long day of sitting, which was its own kind of work, and I was looking forward to eating something, and then writing the first draft of the data sharing proposal before I slept. The proposal would need to be careful. I was asking the Institute to collaborate on a methodology extension that challenged one of their foundational instruments, and the request had to be written in a way that framed it as a contribution rather than a criticism, which it was, though the line between the two was always a matter of presentation. The Keth invigilator fell into step beside me without speaking. We walked the length of the corridor, turned left, went through a set of atmospheric pressure doors into the fellow researcher wing. He stopped at the door to the wing. "Dr. Van," he said. "Yes." "The assessment," he paused. His compact standard was careful and precise. In 62 years, we have not seen this. I know, I said. What you made from the tablet. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, was it difficult to make it, in that room with those tools? I thought about it honestly. The chair had been the wrong height. The composite had been harder than ideal stock and softer than would have been useful. The multi-tool blade was the wrong geometry for that kind of work, and the file had been too small. The noise had been consistent and slightly uncomfortable at certain resonant frequencies. The light was flat and even and had no angle, which meant no shadows to read grain by, which meant I had been working partly by touch. Not particularly, I said. He nodded once, which I took as acceptance rather than agreement, and held the door. I went through. The fellow researcher wing was lit differently from the assessment area, warmer, more variable, designed for longer occupation. There was a small kitchen commons at the far end. I went there, made tea from the packet of black tea I had brought from home because the Institute's provisions did not include anything in the Camellia sinensis family, and sat at the common table. The tea was good. I drank it and thought about the data-sharing proposal structure. The core argument was simple. The 100-fold assessment was a precision instrument for measuring selection behavior under maximal optionality, and it had 62 years of clean data to prove it. That data was not wrong. The database was not wrong. What the instrument needed was not revision but extension. A supplementary protocol for populations in which transformation behavior was a significant response type alongside selection behavior, which would require, at minimum, a physical object submission pathway, a modification of equipment disclosure form, and a revised informed consent document that flagged the possibility of alternate response formats to prevent future assessment equipment damage without prior authorization. In exchange, the Institute would get the first clean field data set on human transformation response under controlled invigilated conditions, which had not previously existed in their database or, as far as I knew, in any database. I would do the write-up. They would co-author if they wanted to. The data was theirs as much as mine. They had built the room, run the sensors, administered the session. I thought this was a reasonable proposal. I thought Aseth would think so too, once she had time to sit with the session and let the procedural discomfort settle. She was a rigorous researcher. Rigorous researchers, in my experience, eventually preferred data to comfort. The difficult part would not be Aseth. The difficult part would be the Institute's Assessment Review Committee, which was, according to the materials I had been sent, a body of 7 senior researchers, 5 Valathan and 2 Keth, whose primary function was to maintain the integrity of the 100-fold assessment database, and whose secondary function was apparently to be alarmed by anything that threatened the integrity of the 100-fold assessment database. I had not met the review committee. I had not been intended to meet them. My fellowship was supposed to run alongside the Institute's research program, not intersect with the committee's jurisdiction. I had now intersected with the committee's jurisdiction fairly directly. I thought about how to frame the proposal section that addressed this. The framing mattered. The argument was, what happened today was not an anomaly to be managed. It was a data point to be analyzed, and the analysis required expanding the instrument's taxonomy, not quarantining the session. This was the correct framing, but it needed to be presented in language that the review committee could engage with rather than react to. Academic committees respond to precedent. The proposal needed to establish that what I had done had precedent, not in the Institute's own database, obviously, but in the broader literature on cognitive behavioral research methodology. There were papers on response format expansion in cross-species assessment contexts. I knew 3 of them directly relevant. I would cite them in the proposal. The thing I would not argue in the proposal, because it would not help, was the underlying point that felt most obvious to me. The 100-fold assessment was a beautiful piece of scientific infrastructure, and 62 years of clean data was an achievement worth respecting. and the most respectful thing you could do with an instrument that had just produced an unexpected result was take the unexpected result seriously. That argument would read as condescension, even though it was genuine. Rigorous researchers knew that already, or they wouldn't have built the instrument. The proposal didn't need to tell them what they already knew. It needed to give them a procedural pathway for doing what they would already want to do once the initial discomfort passed. I wrote the proposal with this in mind. I wrote the collaborative framing section first, then the methodology extension section, then the equipment modification disclosure, then the data sharing terms. The sections fit together in a sequence that moved from what we agreed on to what was new to what needed to be formalized, which was the same sequence you used when presenting any finding that required the audience to revise something they had previously taken as settled. I finished the tea, rinsed the cup, went back to my room and started writing. The first page of the proposal took about 40 minutes because the framing of the first page was the most important part. The rest took another 2 hours. When I finished, I read it through once for clarity, once for tone, once for anything that might read as critical rather than collaborative. It read as collaborative. I saved it and set a reminder to send it to Aseth at 7 the following morning, which was when her calendar showed her first arrival at the Institute. Then I went to sleep. In the morning, I sent the proposal, ate breakfast, and went to the Institute's small library to work on something else entirely, a literature review I had been putting off for 3 weeks. The library was quiet at that hour. I found a table by the window, which looked out on the Institute's exterior atrium, a small enclosed garden of some kind, with plants I didn't recognize and a light source that was clearly artificial but did a reasonable imitation of late afternoon sun. Aseth's reply came just before noon. It was 3 sentences. The first sentence said the review committee had met that morning. The second sentence said the assessment session had been entered into the database as Protocol 7, Atypical Response, Transformation Class, which was a new category designation that had been created at 8 that morning. The third sentence said she accepted the data sharing proposal and suggested they meet Thursday to discuss methodology. I read the 3 sentences twice. Then I went back to the literature review. The atrium light had shifted slightly by the time I looked up again, moving from its afternoon simulation toward something that I supposed was evening. The plants I didn't recognize were doing whatever they did in that kind of light. I had been working for a few hours without noticing. I closed the literature review file, gathered my things, and walked back through the Institute's corridors toward the Fellows' Wing. The assessment chamber was on the upper research deck, 2 floors above me, sealed and presumably reset for the next session, the 100 tiles back in their grid and waiting. The data sharing meeting was Thursday. I had work to do before Thursday. I had time. I had built a blade from the housing of an alien cognition instrument in a sealed room and handed it in as my answer to an exam that had no answer, and the oldest cognitive research institute on the station had spent a morning creating a new database category for what I had done. It was a start. I went to make dinner,